Moonlight pooled at the base of the old tree like a second, colder lantern. Leaves kept a hush as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Something moved along the trunk, a weight sliding, a ripple of skin, and then a man stood where a head of mottled scales had been. He unfolded with the patient grace of a creature that had practiced this becoming for centuries. Shoulders narrowing, ribs rearranging, a neck lengthening into a throat that could hold both breath and a smile. He was impeccable. Evening fog clung to the tailored coat, but could not dull the linen beneath. Fingers that had once tasted earth and root flexed and closed around a leather suitcase heavy with cash and small objects wrapped in silk. For a breath he listened to the roots, an old rhythm beneath the noise of the city. And when he stepped away from the tree, the forest swallowed his passage without complaint. He walked toward the lights, as if those lights had always been waiting. Julia first saw him at the club through a corridor of strobe and perfume, a moment when the beat thinned to make room for gazes. She was laughing, late and bright, her hair caught in the pulse of the room, and the world was a blur of champagne and high heels. Sonia nodded at a waiter. Kem frowned at the crowd. Then he was there. Not the sort who lingered at the bar, but the sort who moved through people like a current, calm, precise, disturbingly present. He wore no name, only that quiet certainty that made people part for him. His smile did not rush. It folded over her like a glove. He offered a drink, then a toast, then a story about a gallery opening that may or may not have been true. He paid for the bottle with a flick of a card, and later, with a flight booked within an hour kind of generosity that felt like a promise. Julia was 23 and hungry for the kind of life that came wrapped in leather and gilded in curated photographs. Her parents had learned, in their way, to eat success. The social dinners, the polite clinks of glass at neighborhood parties. She had learned how to make her teeth look good in candlelight. For a long minute she watched him as if he could be arranged into the life she'd sketched out in small, secret ways. The duplex on the river, the ring with a diamond that wouldn't overwhelm but would announce. Sonia clapped when the man, Doha, leaned closer and said simply, "Julia, may I?" She said the name as if she had authority to offer it, and Julia blurted something ridiculous and bright, because the heat of attention is its own currency. Kem watched the arc of Julia's pleasure and felt his shoulders tighten. Dennis watched from the shadow of the coat room, jaw loose with a kind of anger that did not disguise itself as love. Doha's hands were always cool, as if he'd been holding ice cubes just out of sight. He complimented her in a way that felt like an incantation. Not too many words, but the exact ones to make a pulse quicken.
It was like a thin sheet of fine metal over bone. The cold slid up her wrist and left behind a slow, shuddering warmth that had nothing to do with comfort. He spoke of the tree as if he had been born to its shadow, as if from root to crown he had claims no one else could see. "It keeps things that ought not to forgotten," he said. "It allows me to be uncomplicated." There was a reverence in his words that disarmed as effectively as coin. When she pressed him, when, late that night at her kitchen table, with the city a soft roar beyond the glass, she asked whether everything about him was true, he held up that same old leather suitcase and closed it gently, as if sealing away the question itself. "Some truths are heavy, Julia," he said. "You carry what you can." She did not realize how much she was carrying until she began to dream in scales and knots of vines. In those dreams his eyes were like two moons peering through a canopy, patient, unblinking. Waking felt like stepping out of water. Dennis's presence curved through everything like a rough current. He rapped on the door one afternoon. Jealousy is the sort of emotion that believes urgency justifies violence, and his face had that urgent, bruised look. "You promised we'd talk," he said. "You promised you'd listen." Julia tried to be gentle. "We had a history," she told him, "but this is different." She did not say the truth. That Doha made her feel like permission, and that permission was a currency she had not expected to crave. Dennis, for all his anger, was warm. He missed the small domesticities they had once shared, the messy coffee mugs, his clumsy guitar strings. Doha gave her arrangements and precision, and sometimes the silence of rooms made clean by money. Sonia, at a party where Doha performed the easy manners of wealth, pressed her palms together and laughed the way people do when they want to be seen as grateful. "To think we ever worried about rent," she said, neck gleaming in the light. "Doha has opened doors." Her voice had the faint ring of complicity. She accepted it with the simple enthusiasm of someone who had decided the finish line was reachable. It was during a rain-slicked afternoon, months after the ring and the promises, that the first real fracture happened. Julia woke to an empty apartment and a note. "It is better this way." No signature. It was a small betrayal, blank as a page. She panicked, called numbers that led only to voicemail, left messages that went unanswered. When he returned 3 days later, he apologized in a way that felt rehearsed and effortless. He pressed a palm to her thigh as if to re-anchor them. The apology, like a luxury he offered without cost, calmed a part of her that had expected storms. He sat across from her at dinner and said, quietly, "There are things I cannot tell you yet. There are rituals. There are nights I must answer to the tree." "Doha," she said, trying to be both brave and unafraid, "what are you?"
Pulso todada contra sua rib cage like a caged bird. She could have left. She did not. Instead, she reached for the doorknob of the study where Dolia kept things he called work. The knob was cool, steady, familiar in a way that felt dangerous. When the door opened, the room was darkened by books and photographs, images of architecture and distant islands, nothing overtly sinister. On his desk, however, lay an opened envelope with a single line written across it in a hand she had come to know. To set things right, one must return. She did not understand whether the note was a promise or a threat. The words might as well have been a map. Behind her, the mirror caught the movement of the room, the triangles of light, the silhouette of the tree's shadow pressed like an old memory against the pane. And then, as if the house could no longer hold two truths at once, the reflection shifted, and she saw, unmistakably, the tail.
coiled now in a narrow loop upstairs in the mirror's world, like a question mark poised for a sentence. Something brushed the glass from the other side. It was a small, deliberate slide, like a finger tracing a design. She did not hear footsteps in the hall. She did not hear his voice. The apartment was a sealed thing. Yet the glass answered with the pattern, and the pattern answered with the knowledge that the world she had contracted into ring and sofa and curated months had a seam that could be undone. Julia's fingers clenched around the edge of the table until her knuckles blanched. She had built a life out of other people's approval and the gifts of a man who arrived like winter and left like a rumor. Now the gifts looked smaller, their edges sharpened. The money in his suitcase had bought repairs and dresses and the language to call herself lucky, but the mirror held another ledger, and it did not balance in her favor. She stepped backward. The floor felt unstable, as if the house itself had chosen a side. She thought of the tree and the leather case and the nights of absence. She thought of Sonia laughing, of Cham's caution, of Dennis's rough tenderness. She tried to call out his name, the way one might call for a cat, for a neighbor, for a person who answers to a bell. Her voice was too thin. It did not stir the air. A shadow moved through the reflected study, a ripple across the glass. And where the tail had been, now something like a smile pressed against the inside of the mirror. It wasn't his lips, not entirely. It was the suggestion of a mouth, the curve of something both familiar and alien. She felt the shape of it in her teeth. Her stomach tightened as if the mirror wanted to swallow not only the image but the place inside her where trust sat. The hallway light flickered and steadied. The coin on the hall table trembled as if an unseen breath had touched it. Julia's first instinct was to flee, to call someone, to throw the ring into the river and run.
A next was more dangerous. She lifted her hand, the ring an aching anchor, and touched the glass. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in summer. The surface shivered against her palm in a way that made her whole body recoil. The pattern under the glass flowed like a slow, deliberate current, and for an instant she imagined what it would be like to float in that dark, safe, secret, and accepted. The thought made her knees weak. She pulled her hand back and heard a noise behind her, a soft, wet sound, like something settling. The room remained empty. The city still hummed. And then, with a suddenness that made the hair at the back of her neck rise, the lights in the study, a single bank of recessed bulbs, usually warm, went out. The mirror swallowed the room in an instant, and where the glass had been a reflecting surface, there was nothing but a blackness so thick it seemed to suck warmth away from her bones. Julia could feel the hush of the forest then, as if the tree's breath had come through the walls. Her heart pounded in the stillness. She took a step back, tripping over the low runner. The mirror, now only a dark rectangle, seemed to hold a space larger than the room itself. The thought that Doha had never been fully human, and that the house might be designed to keep him in or to hide him, came unbidden, like a guest who overstays its welcome. She realized with a kind of paralyzed clarity that she had been living with a creature that could fold itself between forms. She also realized, with a more painful clarity, that escape required more than throwing off a ring or moving apartments. It required unfolding a story she barely understood. The forest, the tree, the suitcase of cash, the ritual departures. She wanted to scream, to run into the night and wake the city, to flood it with light until whatever lurked in gilded frames fled. Instead, she sat down on the steps, the wood cool under her palm. When the lights clicked back on, slow, obedient, the room was as it had always been. Photographs, monogrammed stationery, the coffee cup cooling on the desk. The mirror returned her to herself with an ordinary, brutal honesty. The pattern of scales had vanished. The suitcase lay closed and unassuming. Her phone buzzed in the kitchen. A message from Sonia splashed across the screen. Heard about the dinner? Can't wait to celebrate. Doha was not there. The house did not creak with his presence. There was, for a moment, the palpable possibility that the whole thing had been a trick of nerves. But the memory of the cold under his skin and the pattern in the glass would not be so easily dismissed. She thought with a small private dread of the tree waiting somewhere on the city's edge. She imagined him folding himself against its roots, the way a man might return to a childhood home. She imagined the suitcase left open at the base, coins catching moonlight. And then, because horror often arrives on the knees of the mundane, she noticed a small smear of something on the hall table. A dark, almost black leaf pressed flat against the wood, as if someone had left a page from the forest inside her home. The moment held like a photograph, sharp, impossible to move, and then it began to loosen edges. She rose, the ring heavy like a question, and made a decision that was more reflex than brave. She would go to the tree. Not that night, she was not so foolish, but soon, to see, to understand, to pull the seams of the tapestry apart and see what ran through them. If the man she loved could be a thing that folded like paper into a different skin, then she needed to know the language by which he answered to the tree. She left the house with the leather suitcase unopened and the coin inside it. She placed the coin in her pocket like a talisman. She did not tell Sonia or Chem. Secrets are often carried like currency, and she did not yet know whether this one would buy her freedom or cost her everything. Outside, the city refused to admit the strangeness that had unfolded inside her hallway. Cars glided, neon made little promises, and laughter leaped between buildings. Trees on the boulevard were small and polite compared to the cathedral of root and bark she had seen at the city's edge. Yet as she walked, a thin, insistent knowledge, the memory of the smell of herb and loam, clung to the back of her throat. On the tram home, a child laughed and shoved a champion fidget toy into the air. The world pressed on. But underneath the ordinary, like a second root system, the knowledge of something ancient and patient waited. At home, she stood before the mirror one more time. The glass reflected a woman at the cusp of choices she had not planned to make. The ring winked at her, as if it had always known secrets and only now permitted them to be visible. She touched the diamond and thought of coin and tree and cold fingers. Then she tucked the coin into a drawer, closed it, and locked it with a key she kept on a ribbon. The next morning, The suitcase was gone. Julia found it missing before she realized she had been expecting it to be there. The hall table held only a streak where the leather had once sat, and the absence of the coin's absence felt like a small, precise theft. She tried to tell herself that perhaps she had moved it in a dream. Perhaps he had taken it to the tree and would return with explanations as neat and polished as his cufflinks. Later that day, while she stood over the sink rinsing a glass, she noticed again how cool the windowsill felt when she leaned on it. Like a hand that did not quite belong to the warmth of her life, the feeling threaded under her skin. She did not know whether to call someone or to go alone into a forest that had shown her its shadows. That night she dreamed again, of scales slipping like coins, and of a man folding himself into the hollow of a tree. She woke with a mouth tasted faintly of iron, and when she walked to the mirror, the reflection waited for her like a verdict. She was not ready for what the mirror would give her next. The glass did not lie, it revealed. This time, when she looked, the reflection was layered. There was her face and the room, and there, like a film, a memory superimposed. In that film, Doha stood at the base of the tree with his hands on the trunk. He was a man and not a man. He had his suitcase open. Leaves fluttered from it like confetti. The camera of her mind was merciless. The tail curled across the frame and then tightened into something that looked very nearly like a promise. Her phone buzzed and she jumped, the image in the glass scattering into fragments. The message was from an unknown number. "You look beautiful when you let me go." She stared at the message until the letters blurred into a smear of meaning she did not want to parse. There was no signature, but there never needed to be one. Across the city, the night pressed close, and somewhere in the dark, a tree turned quietly, as if an enormous animal were stretching. Julia stood before the mirror with her hand over her mouth and watched the room and the echo of a forest negotiate their outlines. When she finally lowered her hand, the ring glittered, indifferent. She had never suspected that her perfect fiancé was not human until the mirror revealed his true form. She realized then, with a clarity that felt like a cleaver, that the question was no longer whether to stay or leave. It was which she would become if she chose to remain. The woman who accepted the lie for comfort, the woman who tore it apart, or the woman who, like the tree's root, would anchor herself in both worlds and risk being eaten by whichever life fed on her first. There was a rustle from the open window, like a far-off hiss. She pressed her forehead to the glass, breath fogging the surface, and watched the room behind her as if it might rearrange itself into truth. The mirror did not grant forgiveness. It merely reflected what stood in front of it. She turned away and sank onto the couch, the diamond heavy, the house too loud. In the quiet between the beats of her pulse, she felt the echo of cold fingers and the press of the tree's shadow like an invitation. She did not know where Doha had gone. She did not know whether he would come back. She only knew that the mirror had shown her an impossibility, made it sudden and urgent. Outside, at the city's fringe, the old tree stood patient as a god. Under its roots, something like a mind considered the night and decided that the engagement of one human heart could be a beginning worth watching. Inside, Julia folded her hands in her lap and tried to imagine the future in which she walked away. The image of the suitcase closed at the tree haunted her. The leather like a promise, the coins jingling, quiet as a prayer.
She felt the tremor of a choice forming, the thin, sharp line of it cutting through her like a map. She reached for her phone and hesitated. The number she dialed was not Doha's. It was Kem's. "Come over," she said when he answered. Her voice did not shake as much as she feared. "I need you." He came. He brought coffee and a look that mixed concern and restraint. He did not ask many questions. He sat with her on the couch and watched her tell fragments: the park, the suitcase, the mirror. He did not laugh. He did not tell her she was being foolish. He kept his hands on his knees as if steadying himself for a length of truth. "Don't go to the park alone," he told her at the end, "and don't let him take you anywhere you don't want, okay?" She nodded, and then took a breath that felt steadier. For an instant, the world rearranged into a map of choices. Friends who could be anchors, a mirror that could be a warning, a tree that could be a door. Outside, hidden in the city's edge, the tree made a small sound like a settling of bone. Under its bark, something moved and stretched, and the night listened. Doha, somewhere between man and root, folded himself into a shape that could enter rooms as easily as a thought. He had a patience older than her fear. He had a plan, thick with the slow craft of hunger. And in the glass of her hallway, a pattern of scales lingered like a ledger, a record of what had been and what might be. Julia slid down until the couch held her like a confession. She had never suspected that her perfect fiancé was not human. Now that she had seen it, the mirror's reflection turned from revelation into strategy. She could not unknow it. She had to decide what to do with the knowledge. The city thrummed obliviously. Somewhere a siren faded into night. The tree, a silent witness, waited. Julia did not sleep. She sat and watched her reflection as if the mirror might offer counsel. When dawn thinned the shadows, a single thought insisted: know the rules. Find the tree. Untie the suitcase. Ask the questions that had no easy answers. And when she thought she could not bear the weight of the waiting, she remembered the coolness of his touch, the way his fingers had rested at the base of her palm, and the way the world around her had bent in response when he gave money like absolution. She realized that what he offered was not love, but leverage. It had the scent of purchase. She had accepted it so far for reasons that felt, in the quiet of morning, both foolish and inevitable. She rose then, the ring a compass at her finger, and dressed with the methodical calm of someone who had been handed a plan and had to follow it. She would not go alone, she promised herself. She would take friends, or a camera, or somebody who could stand between her and the thing in the trees. She would find out whether the suitcase was a token of devotion or a trap. In the hall, the mirror watched her with its surface of cool truth. For a breath, she thought she saw, in its white glass depth, the shadow of scales uncoiling like a question. She closed the door behind her and stepped into the city, where the ordinary world hummed like a mask. At the edge of the park, where the manicured grass gave way to the old path, the air smelled different, leaf mold and something like iron. The tree held its arms up to the sky. At its base, leaves muttered. The leather suitcase was not there. That absence felt like an answer.
She pressed her palm to the bark and felt faintly a tremor, an echo from the night when the man had shifted into a suit and a smile and a set of impossible promises. She should have left then. She did not. Behind her, the city continued to glow. She stepped a little closer, listening for the sound the mirror had shown her in a half-dream, a hiss like breath, a soft, deliberate movement, the sound of something ancient deciding. Her phone vibrated. A message lit the screen. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" Her heart stuttered. The message had no name. For a moment she thought it was a prank. Then she remembered the coin, the suitcase, the cold. She typed in one word, "No." The reply was immediate. It read, "Then don't." Behind the message, the world held its breath. The tree considered. The mirror remembered. And in the thin space between decision and action, the night pressed like a question that had been asked for a very long time. Julia stood at the border of two lives and made the first choice of many. She would not, she told herself, be consumed by a life she had not chosen. A movement at the edge of the tree line caught her eye, a whisper of coat, a flicker of motion, and the hairs on her arms rose. The city felt miles away. The park smelled of wet roots and old offerings. The suitcase was not at the base of the tree, but somewhere, just beyond sight, she thought she could hear the soft, deliberate weight of something settling. She understood, with a clarity that could not be swallowed, that her life had become a ledger between human things and older, more patient economies. She had been given an offer, a life bought with coin, and a presence that was not quite a person. The mirror had revealed the truth, and with the truth came the obligation to act. Behind her, someone laughed in the distance, a sound that belonged to a world that would not understand. She turned back toward the city, and then walked deeper into the shade. The tree accepted her without question. The roots, gossiping under the soil, took her step into their ledger. She did not know then whether she sought to save herself or to join him. She only knew the mirror had shown her the choice. It had not and could not tell her what to do next. A low hiss threaded the air, and somewhere under the bark a coil tightened like a promise.